the governments of Europe remained silent and turned a blind eye on the slaughter of political prisoners and the crackdown on people's protests. Therefore, giving an open hand to the regime, they thought the human rights abuses would be limited to within the Iranian borders. The experience of the past 3 decades has proven that this is a mistaken view and a wrong policy. The mullahs considered this policy as a sign of weakness of the West. They found out that their path was open to bomb-making and to aggression on the stability and national sovereignty of countries in the Middle East. I urge you to support the Iranian people's demand for the international prosecution of Khamenei and Raisi for the massacre of political prisoners and the November 2019 killings. And I urge you to call on governments to Europe to condition their relations and negotiations with the clerical regime on its bringing to halt the arrest of protesters as well as torture and executions in prisons.
Eventually, every 80% of business activity of Iran is still under control of Revolutionary Guard. They are arm of Mullah's regime that was directly responsible for killings, including murders, mass murders of their own compatriots. And that we have not only to condemn, we have to ensure that no impunity is to be continued, including the highest ranking posts.
And we need to condemn all the attacks that the protesters are suffering. Also, we need to remember, and that's why it's so important to remember the massacre of 1988, which is a genocide and a crime against humanity. And we need to give voice to that and remember, constantly remember, huge violations to the human rights and to the people in Iran that are taking place right now.
Let us to express full support for your fight for freedom and democracy.
Nous connaissons Madame Rajavi comme la leader du mouvement d'opposition démocratique iranienne. Elle est en fait le visage du mouvement totalement l'opposé des mullahs au pouvoir maintenant. Et elle représente, à mon avis, l'espoir peut-être de l'engagement aussi d'un Iran libre.
Und all das wird in Iran nicht praktiziert. Es sind Verbrecher am Werke, wir sprechen es ruhig aus, die nur dem Machterhalt dienen und dem Volk schaden.
And obviously what is practiced in Iran is completely the opposite. So you see, violence against people and against human rights, and that is obviously not coherent with that religious message.
Unfortunately, the nationwide and continuing uprising of the Iranian people in various provinces and in recent weeks in Isfahan draws less attention than, for example, the nuclear talks in Vienna. And despite the nuclear talks have ended without any results. You made the historic transfer of the PMOI members out of Iraq to safety possible. You will as well one day have democracy and you will see freedom in Iran.
Because this Iranian regime cannot be our partner. We know this regime. We know who are a member of this regime. We remember many massacres of this regime, a crime against humanity. So finally, I would like to stress I support you, Maryam Rajavi, your political movement, and I fully support a free and democratic Iran. Thank you.
The second important point is that the support to make a real progress towards the European Parliament to officially declare the massacre of 1988 as an act of genocide. That will be very, very important, and I think that we will be able to gather all the necessary support to take the final steps in this process.
And among UN member states, the landmark trial in Sweden of Hamid Nouri, accused of mass execution of political prisoners, is a pivotal moment for victims long denied recognition and justice. We are here today to express our full trust that the only viable alternative to the current rogue regime is represented by this movement led by an extraordinary and inspiring woman, the President-elect Madame Maryam Rajavi.
The democratic opposition we support is led by a woman. And women in this organization have very, very crucial responsibilities at all levels. So it's good that Europe is worried about women in Afghanistan, but it's time also to think as a priority in women in Iran and to support this incredible woman that leads the Iranian resistance, and it's the best hope for a democratic change one day in Iran.
As a supporter of the cause of human rights and democracy in Iran, I believe that the European Union must stand with the people of Iran who are rejecting the regime and its president, Ebrahim Raisi. The world knows Raisi is a mass murderer and not a representative of Iranian people. He must be prosecuted for executing tens of thousands of opposition members from the PMOI and other Iranian activists during the last 33 years who said no to mullahs and demanded freedom and democracy.
It is a duty of all the international community to pursue those who are responsible for genocide. This duty can never be put away. And for those who have, as always in the past, nurtured these appeasement ideas that, well, we have something more important. We have the nuclear deal and we will convince the mullahs to be peaceful.
In recent years, there has been important progress as more human rights experts, organizations, and parliamentarians, including the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Iran, support and add their voice to this demand for justice and accountability to end impunity for human rights abusers in Iran. We expect and urge High Representative Mr. Borrell to recognize the 1988 massacre as a genocide and to ask the United Nations and High Commissioner for Human Rights to immediately launch an investigation into 1988 massacre in Iran.
In every protest, we see that women are in the forefront. They are the ones who are leading the protests. And this in the Iranian resistance movement is also evident, which is being led by a Muslim democratic woman such as Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. Women have different important roles in the resistance movement, and this is giving us a lot of hope for a free and democratic Iran.
So the JCPOA is dead in the water, and Joseph Borrell would be well advised to abandon his policy of appeasement of this repressive regime and turn his attention instead to providing EU support for the Iranian people who long for freedom and who long for an end to violent repression.
It proved how brutal the regime is. So the regime is only fighting for itself, for its own survival in this important historical moment. Therefore, this is an important moment for the history. The world community must have a correct policy. And it's important that we have cooperation and solidarity on both sides of the Atlantic, and to have a common policy about human rights and about the nuclear program of the regime.
Thousands of people are being executed in Iran, including women, for having a different view of developments in the country. I am glad that Mrs. Rajavi is fighting for the rights of these people who want freedom, and I am honored to be able to support her.
Necessary because we must multiply our pressure on the European External Action Service, on the High Representative for Common Security Policy, and on national governments of EU member states to change their strategy in relation to the Iranian totalitarian theocracy. For decades, appeasement, dialogue, and negotiations have come to no result. The Iranian clerics have never ceased their promotion of terrorist actions in the Middle East and beyond, their proxy wars, their systematic violations of human rights inside Iran.
People of Iran who have been oppressed for too long and who were stripped to their basic rights. I find particularly concerning the situation of Iranian women who are seen as second-class citizens and whose rights to sexual and reproductive health were recently yet again violated by the new legislation.
We accepted the responsibility to prevent other genocides. So it means that we have to stay together to support the dignity of human beings. Despite that, the international organization and democratic institutions have been disappointing in regard to what's happening in Iran. The people of Iran have the worst human rights, the human rights which is committed by the regime. We have to remember that the policy of carrot and stick has been useless, because the regime is doing the opposite. And the commitment for a free Iran and end genocide is not just a moral duty, it's an obligation.